Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeremy Didier. I am the group founder and co-coordinator of ADHDKC, which is Kansas City's CHAD chapter. And tonight we have our award-winning parent group. On the screen, you can see a little bit more about CHAD, which is Children and Adults with ADHD. And we encourage you to become a member. It's great if you come to our meetings and if you get our newsletter and if you interact with us on our Facebook group and our website, but we really encourage everyone to become a member if they can, because when you become a member, you get all kinds of fabulous benefits like Attention Magazine, either electronically or in person, massive discounts on the annual ADHD conference and discounts on other things. You get access to prescription discounts and other school discounts. There's lots of really cool stuff and access to our professional library. We have a lot of amazing free resources, but we also have some amazing resources that you can't have access to unless you become a member. So we encourage you to become a member. All members received some of those benefits there, and I'll just kind of blow through this because you can look at it if you join online. That's at chad.org, or you can just scan that QR code right there. We also want to know what you guys would like to see. So ADHDKC offers monthly meetings for parents, adults, teenagers, and women with ADHD, but we're open to anything. You know, Dr. Seppi and I started this group, gosh, 14 almost years ago now, which is terrifying. And, you know, we just kind of put it together when it was convenient for us back in the day. But we like to move around. We like to try new things. We want to make sure that we're providing content and speakers and information and topics that you want to hear about in locations that you can either come to or join online on the days or times that work for you. So definitely scan that QR code and let us know what kinds of things you would like to see, or let us know what we're doing well. So coming up for our next couple meetings for the adults group in October, we're going to be talking about creating an ADHD-friendly environment. And that's going to be at the address you see on the screen there at the bottom. In order to RSVP or sign up for any of these exciting events, go to our website, not chad.org. Chad.org is to become a member. ADHDKC.org/events is where you're going to go to RSVP for the event, and you will get reminders and get added to the calendar so that you don't miss it. And we're ADHD friendly, so we like to send a lot of reminders. You can turn them off if you want, but I personally need them. So that's always a good thing. Make sure you go to the website to register there. In our parents group next month, Dr. Karen Jordan and Kari Wold from the Jordan Psychological Assessment Center are going to be presenting on getting diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, getting diagnosed with ADHD, what all is involved, how things overlap. Next month's parents meeting is going to be one of our hybrid meetings, which means we'll be meeting in person at the Kansas City Girls Preparatory Academy. And it's at the address you see on your screen there. We will also be broadcasting online. I have to warn you, the past times we've done this, we've had a little bit of technical difficulty, so the view online is not great. So I encourage you to attend in person. And again, RSVP at adhdkc.org/events. You just click on the event that you want to go to and put in your name and email address, and you're automatically added to the list. Our teen group next month will also be hybrid, again, at the Kansas City Preparatory Academy for Girls, and it's going to be energy vampires. And I'm always so torn because Dr. Steppi's teen group always looks really fun. And I'm like, I really want to learn more about that. So if you want to go to both but can't, we will be recording them, and you can catch the other one after the event. And then again, in November, we're going to be online. We'll be virtual again, like we are for this month. And we're going to be talking about ADHD in sports, from participating to competing, what parents need to know. Really looking forward to that one. The folks from Order Out of Chaos are going to be presenting for us. And again, go to adhdkc.org/events to RSVP. As you guys know, we are a CHAD chapter, and that means that our group does not endorse or support or recommend any specific product, service, publication, medication, provider, or treatment. And now for the fun and fabulous, we're going to introduce Miss Emily-Kircher Morris, who is with the Neurodiversity Podcast. And tonight she's going to be presenting on suicidality and self-injury. And I got to see Emily present last year in November in Baltimore at the big ADHD conference. And I think I stalked her a little bit after. I was like, oh, she's amazing. We have to get her to present. And then I found out she lives in St. Louis. And then I'm like, okay, Midwesterner, sold. And then I just kept bugging her. And I think we set this up almost a year ago, maybe like 8 months ago. And you've been so kind and so awesome to agree to join us. And so what I'm going to do now is stop my share and turn it over to you so you can share. And I'll
Perfect.
let you take it away. And if you're just joining us, participants, go ahead and keep yourself on mute. You can leave your camera on or turn it off. We like to have, I think I said it so when you come in, it's off, but this meeting is being recorded. And if you have questions, you can post them in the chat. I believe Emily's going to take questions at the end or in the middle or wherever you take a breath, I can pop in. Otherwise, I'm just going to let you take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, no, and I'll kind of keep an eye on the chat, but also not really too much. So don't if it's we'll save some time hopefully at the end though. So yeah, so I'm happy to be here and to be talking to everybody. And for everyone who's watching later on the recording, hopefully this is good information. It's always a heavy topic, but it's really important, especially as parents. So I'll give you a little bit of background. Maybe I will if I can get hang on, I know what's going on here. There we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. I am an author, I'm a podcast host, but I'll tell you a little bit kind of about how I got to where I am. So I actually was diagnosed with ADHD back when I was a kid. And as any of you know, as adults, like those of us of a certain age, that was pretty rare, especially for girls. And I know that it was interesting because while I had that diagnosis and I was able to take medication as a kid, I didn't really have a lot of understanding about it. I didn't necessarily really quite, my teachers didn't really know how to support me. And so as I started my career, I went into education and I taught for over a decade in the schools. I taught in the elementary school classroom as well as the middle school classroom. I also taught in gifted education programs. And so that's what you see these book titles here that talk about twice exceptional learners. And if you're unfamiliar, twice exceptional is a term that refers to kids who are both cognitively gifted and have another diagnosis layered on top of that. And so that might be ADHD, it might be autism. And through all of that, my husband and I started the Neurodiversity Podcast. I'm super excited about my next book, which is coming out in January, Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported. So, what I have actually done though throughout my career, after I left education, I went and got a second master's degree in counseling and family therapy. So I'm a licensed professional counselor, and that's primarily what I do right now. I work in private practice in O'Fallon outside of St. Louis. And I support neurodivergent kids and teens and their families, and really, have a lot of opportunities to kind of spread the word about how to create a more neurodiversity affirming world. I am the parent to 3 children, all of whom have an ADHD diagnosis. My husband's ADHD, so it's a lot of that. And I'll also just say, as far as neurodiversity goes, I was assessed when I was a kid before Asperger's was even in the DSM. And I know that that's one of those things that probably, if I were a kid today, we would have at least assessed it. I recognize a lot of those traits in myself. But I've never gone through another assessment process as an adult. So, all those things really kind of inform my work, as far as being a parent, somebody who is neurodivergent and a clinician and an educator. That's kind of the angle that I come at everything from. So what are we going to talk about today? So today our goals really are about understanding the risks of suicidal thoughts and self-injury in children and teens with ADHD. We're going to talk about how to recognize warning signs so that you can support your kids. And we want to develop strategies to build on your child or teen's strengths to improve their well-being. So how can we really work to do that? So I want to just talk briefly about suicidal spectrum behaviors and kind of thinking about specifically how this varies as we kind of progress in areas like levels of concern. So it's first of all recognizing that for ADHDers there is an increased risk for suicidal ideation and non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. So compared to those without ADHD, people who have an ADHD diagnosis think about suicide more often. They're 3 times more likely to think about suicide and have suicidal ideation. They're 4 times as likely to make a plan for suicide. and they're twice as likely to attempt suicide. Now, luckily, of course, these are still very small numbers, but we want to be aware of the fact that ADHD specifically, because of some of the traits that are associated with it, because of some of the characteristics, it is that in and of itself is a risk factor that we need to be aware of and monitoring with our kids and teens. So self-injurious behaviors, what does that even really mean? So self-injurious behaviors specifically can include cutting, scratching, biting, burning yourself, all of these different things. And they are often a way to cope with emotional pain, but it's a maladaptive coping skill. And so it's more common when ADHD is combined with anxiety or depression, and it can be linked with high impulsivity. But the thing that I really want to mention specifically about self-injurious behaviors is just that it is not, self-injurious behaviors are not the same as suicidal ideation. They really kind of live in two different worlds. So that second bullet point there, where I'm talking about how it's often used to cope with emotional pain, what you should really know is that, again, self-injurious behaviors are about trying to find a way to handle feelings of overwhelm, feelings of frustration, whatever that might be. And it is a maladaptive coping skill that we want to come and replace that, substitute it with something that's more healthy. But usually the intent is not, to harm oneself in with the goal of dying. And so we'll talk about those a little bit separately, but there is kind of the differentiation between those two pieces. So what are some of those very specific, unique risk factors for ADHD kids? What does that really mean? What are we talking about there? So first of all, we can talk about just the impact of interpersonal dynamics. So we know that about 50 to 70% of kids with ADHD experience significant peer relationship difficulties more than their peers. They often have fewer friends, their friendships are lower quality, and they experience greater peer victimization. And they're also more likely to be rejected or neglected by peers compared to typically developing kids. So why is this? Well, it's a variety of different things. Part of it is just because ADHDers are sometimes pretty impulsive, or sometimes they're a little bit aloof, and that makes it harder to build some of those really strong connections. Sometimes, that then influences your friendships. And so Carol McGuire, who wrote the book, Why Will No One Play With Me? We had her on the podcast, and one of the things she was talking about as far as the difficulties with social relationships for ADHD kids is the fact that, when you have fewer positive interactions with your peers, it's like you don't get the same accumulation of time and practice with those skills. And so then that makes it harder then to maintain. So when you have those interpersonal dynamics and those relationships that aren't necessarily living up to what you hope that they would be, what you really want them to be, that definitely does impact your overall self-esteem, how you see yourself, how you feel connected in the world. And that loneliness can be a major factor that can lead to the thoughts of suicidal ideation or self-injury. Also, a lot of times, if you have kids and they have a negative peer reputation, research also shows that continues through adolescence. So if you have a kiddo who's super impulsive when they're young and they have a harder time developing those friendships, especially if they stay in that same school setting with that same peer group, that also follows them, and it's hard to shed some of that persona that people believe that you might have. We, of course, also have academic challenges that a lot of ADHD kids experience. And along with those academic challenges, there's other pieces that go along with this. So first of all, one of the major factors that is necessary for kids to overcome some of those academic challenges is the fact that they have to be able to self-advocate. However, when we talk about self-advocacy, that requires a level of self-disclosure. And self-disclosure is scary. There's stigma surrounding it. Additionally, there's so many kids who, when you talk to them about accommodations, when you talk to them about supports, they don't want those accommodations or supports because they feel like it's not fair. They don't always understand that it's actually leveling the playing field for them. They feel like it's an unfair advantage, so then they don't want to do that, or they just don't want to be different. They don't want to go out of the classroom to work in a quiet environment. They don't want to, have to put on, headphones or whatever to tune out the other noise. And so that also then impacts those academic challenges. But if you're struggling with school, if you're constantly getting, forgetting to get your homework turned in, or you're not getting your work done, if you're taking so much time to get that work finished that you're then having to take it home later to complete it, and you spend a lot of time doing homework, all of that is going to have a negative impact on how you view that academic setting. The other thing about ADHD kids is that often in the school setting, their strengths might really be unrecognized because, and this is true in a lot of different places, but depending on a child's individual profile, a child or teen's individual profile, it kind of depends what comes to the surface. Do those ADHD traits come to the surface a lot, or are they pretty good at masking and kind of hiding those things? And if they have a harder time masking and hiding those things, sometimes those strengths go unrecognized. You might have a child who is brilliant, who can do a lot of different things, academically, but if their quote unquote behavior is so difficult because they're interrupting, or they're, not getting started on their work in a timely manner that their teacher feels like they should, that's going to become the focus as opposed to the strengths that they actually have. And so when you don't have that opportunity to build those strengths, again, what are those emotions? What are those feelings? What are those experiences that lead to whatever the next thing is in that academic setting? We know that there's just often not a lot of availability of environmental accommodations in the school settings. It was so interesting. My oldest is 16. He's a junior in high school. And when he started high school, he actually was going to take a pre-AP class of some type. And so when he wanted to do that, he came home with a syllabus. He had to have the syllabus signed. And although he does have a 504 plan, in this syllabus, this teacher had written no headphones or earbuds ever in my classroom. Like basically, like there was no, and I think it even said like no exceptions. And that's often the mentality that teachers have, but what they don't realize is that for some kids, that might be a really helpful accommodation for them to be able to listen to music, specifically usually music that doesn't have any words, but teachers have these expectations, and then that prevents people from accessing those accommodations. And so that's another factor that influences that. I don't know why a teacher would ever put that in a syllabus like that, worded in such a black and white way, because kids are, who's going to ask at that point if that's, already written there and everyone knows about it. So, we know that novelty is actually an amazing tool for ADHDers. It's something that really can help to just kickstart that motivation, get something started. But often the academic setting doesn't maintain that novelty. And so we might have a lot of energy and excitement about starting something at the beginning, but then, as it kind of goes through the school year, that novelty wears off, and that makes it harder. That third quarter slump is a real thing for a lot of ADHD kids, where, it's just really hard to maintain that for such a long amount of time. And then another factor that comes into play is that because of some of those lagging executive functioning skills, many ADHDers actually learn to lean on and become perfectionists in order to compensate for it, because they get that negative feedback, they get in trouble, they aren't doing well, they're not getting the grades that they want or that they need. And so the way that they compensate for that is becoming almost hyper vigilant about spending a lot of time working on their homework. It's spending a lot of time looking over everything, where they really are, it's to their detriment. It causes more stress, more anxiety, and eventually burnout. So these are all factors, again, that when you have these stressors in your life, when you don't have those accommodations met, when you're receiving those messages that you're having a hard time or you're not doing well enough, these are the things that accumulate and lead to more of that anxiety or the depression. as well as the, eventually perhaps suicidal ideation or, NSSIB. So emotion-focused coping style is something that a lot of ADHDers do throughout the lifespan. This is not specific just to children and teens. And specifically, what I mean by this is that, well, here's really this first piece is that this is positively correlated with higher rates of suicidal ideation, meaning that kids and teens or adults who tend to try to cope with frustrations or uncomfortable situations, whatever it might be, with this emotion-focused coping style, have higher rates of suicidal ideation. So what exactly is that? So first of all, it's about seeking emotional support or venting emotion about their emotions. Venting is really not a super productive way to cope with uncomfortable feelings. It actually often almost exacerbates, it's like kind of like stoking the flame. And so while it might feel good in the moment, especially if you have somebody who's like kind of right there with you and can, kind of validate those emotions, that's helpful, but it's not actually solving the problem. Another emotion focused coping style is just avoiding the problems or denying the problems, just like kind of staying away from them. The problem with any of these is that they aren't focused on actionable steps. So if you have a child who's coming to you and they just want to vent, it's one thing to say, okay, do you want me to listen or do you want me to help problem solve? But if they just want you to listen and you notice that's just becoming more like complaining / venting, you really want to try to put that into some parameters for them. Like, we're going to spend 10 minutes, I'm going to let you vent, but then we're going to like close the book on that and move on because it's not helpful. It doesn't actually solve the problem. I have some clients who I work with, and I kind of joke with them, because this is a very natural way that some kids respond to things. I'm like, but they're the kids who have a problem for every solution. It's like you try to brainstorm ideas, and it's like they don't want to hear any of that. They really just want to be in that negative space. But we really want to focus on those coping skills. If you can't solve the problem, how can you shift your emotions? How can you manage those feelings a little bit better so that you're not feeling so overwhelmed and you really can improve how you're feeling? But any of those things can increase the risk of suicidal thoughts, because if you're just stuck there, right? You're just stuck and you're not actually feeling like you can move forward. And the thing that leads to a lot of that suicidal ideation often is the feeling that people feel like they can't, there's no escape. Like the way that they're feeling right now is the way that they're going to be feeling forever, and they just don't see a way out. And so we want to make sure that they're focused more on the problem solving as opposed to just really focusing on those negative or uncomfortable emotions. Rejection sensitivity is a term that you may have heard. So you may have heard it talked about as rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD. There's some different research that's out there about this. I find it pretty fascinating. But specifically, well, a couple of different things. There's debate about specifically what's going on when we're talking about rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Some people think that it's really just about like the brain wiring of the ADHD brain is more sensitive to negative feedback and less, doesn't react as much to the positive feedback. There's also kind of the camp that really talks about how it's more of a trauma response, where if you're an ADHDer and as you're growing up, you get lots and lots of negative feedback because you're having to be redirected, you have to be told what to do, you're having a hard time, with those executive functioning skills, that then it becomes like this, increased sensitivity to criticism. And the way I kind of understand it, it really seems like it's a little bit of both. But they've actually done some studies here where they look at the MRIs and they can actually give individuals some negative feedback as well as positive feedback. And they can see in the MRIs that ADHDers tend to have an increased sensitivity or increased neural activity related to that negative feedback, but they also have a decreased responsiveness to the positive feedback. And so in my mind, that kind of goes back to that first theory where we're talking about like there's something else going on when we think about like the dopamine and the reward systems as far as ADHD and feeling motivated to do things. That decreased responsiveness to the positive feedback, that doesn't seem like it's just so much of a trauma response over a longer amount of time. And so we want to, know what this ends up leading to. It can lead to avoiding social situations or becoming really defensive. And so, we can recognize this. And the other piece that's really important here is realizing that relationship difficulties were much more prevalent in suicide attempts in an ADHD group versus a non-ADHD group. And this is associated with that rejection sensitivity, because if you're experiencing relationship difficulties, that often feels like rejection. And if you have that rejection sensitivity and those relationship difficulties, then that might lead to an increased risk of suicide. So impulsivity fits into this as well. This is another trait that kind of really impacts this. So if you think about this, it makes really clear sense. So if somebody is feeling really down and they are having suicidal ideation, if they are also impulsive, there's more of a risk that they are going to take action without really thinking about all of the, impact later on down the line. What's that domino effect going to be? And so that in and of itself really is a risk factor. So there's a behavior scale, the UPS-P impulsive behavior scale. And not that that's something that's super relevant for you as parents necessarily, but I like the way that it breaks down the different types of impulsivity. So specifically, the first one is negative urgency. So the tendency to act impulsively under conditions of negative affect, meaning something bad happened and I'm just going to act on it. I'm going to do something right away. Positive urgency is the impulsivity to respond to positive emotions. I'm excited. This is cool. I'm going to go do this thing. I'm just going to react and, whatever it is. The lack of premeditation. So just that difficulty in thinking and reflecting on the consequences of an act before engaging in it. Lack of perseverance, which is difficulty just remaining focused on a task that feels boring or uninteresting. And then sensation seeking. So the tendency to seek out novel and thrilling experiences. So the number one type of impulsiveness that was most highly correlated with suicidal ideation and attempts was the negative urgency, that tendency to act really impulsively under conditions of negative affect. And then the next two that had a moderate impact on it were the lack of premeditation and the sensation seeking, that just like that need to like have that rush, that feeling. It's like, I'm just going to do this thing because it has an impact there. So we really want to kind of be monitoring our kids. See if you can notice if they tend to be impulsive. Do you notice where it fits within these five, regardless of whether or not they're experiencing thoughts of self-injury or suicide? This can just help you have a better awareness of how to support them, how to help them build their awareness. Like, hey, look, I noticed that when you are feeling upset or angry, you tend to really act really impulsively in those moments. That's like when you have the least amount of restraint, or response inhibition. And so how can we kind of be aware of that? Or, whatever that might be for your particular child. But we know that impulsivity really impacts. And just like I was just mentioning on the previous slide, when we couple that with the rejection sensitivity, with the relationship difficulties, that is a major risk factor for our kids. So self-advocacy skills are just super important. And, what helps kids have positive self-advocacy skills? A big part of that really is how much success they've had in the past. If you are constantly trying to self-advocate and not getting any results, you are probably less likely to try to self-advocate in the future. So what that means for us as parents is that we really have to set the stage. So often we talk about teaching kids self-advocacy skills, give them a script, tell them, time and place, help them come up with a way that they can do this. However, as adults, and again, I do a lot of work with clinicians and educators as well as parents, but we need to be the ones who are opening the doors to that self-advocacy. If you think to yourself about a time that you had to self-advocate, often that is to a person who is in a position of power or somebody whose relationship and trust you really respect. You don't want to damage that relationship. It is hard to self-advocate. It's really hard to stand up and say, this isn't working for me. I need something different. And so for our kids, we can't expect them just to do that without having really effective practice. So one of the things we can really do with this is help them have that opportunity, open that door, offer opportunities, tell me what you think would work. or let's talk about this for a little bit, and I want to hear your ideas. And sometimes they'll have a really terrible idea, and sometimes if it's not something, we can just go with it to help them feel like their voice is heard and important, and that we trust them, with their judgment there. So that is going to help them. But it didn't, again, even whether it's at school or with friends or wherever it is, if they are consistently getting shut down when they try to self-advocate, they're less likely to attempt to self-advocate in the future. So the other piece of this is, some of our kids have just a hard time with some of that social problem solving. And so this is where we want to give them more opportunities to really figure out, like, who are you going to go advocate to? How are you going to do it? If you need to advocate with a teacher, can you go ahead and, write them an email if you don't feel like talking to them in person, or wait till the class, leaves and you're the teacher's the only one in there, you talk to them one-on-one. How can we make sure that they have, feel safe doing that and know how to approach that as they need to self-advocate? So let's talk a little bit more just about the self-injurious behaviors, and kind of what that looks like with our kids. So why might ADHDers use non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors? So the purpose of this can be a lot of different things. When I talk to kids who have, disclosed to me that they have been cutting or scratching or burning or whatever that might be, we know I try to figure out what is behind that, what's underneath that. And so I talk to them and I just kind of try to brainstorm with them. And usually these are just some of the experiences that kids will tell me about. So first of all, they're just feeling numb. They want to feel something, whatever that might be. Oh, quick fun. And so that is a way for them to have some sort of sensation. Sometimes it's because they want to punish themselves for making a mistake or doing something that they felt was embarrassing, or that they don't want to, that they're ashamed of. Kind of goes along with that, but distracting from other emotional pain. Something that has happened is like, I just need, I don't want to think about that anymore. And so I could think about this. Sometimes it's like, I'm feeling so terrible emotionally, internally, and I don't necessarily even understand why. But if I cut or I scratch, then I have this outward manifestation that represents that pain. It's almost like, okay, it's almost like a tangible way to make that connection with that emotional overwhelm. And sometimes it's just about experiencing the sensation that's not even necessarily a whole lot more than that. And there are others too. But what I would encourage you as a parent is, if you find out that your child is, using self-injury, we really want to make sure that we're not shaming them, and that we are normalizing the fact that a lot of people have these feelings, right? And we don't necessarily want to, we can ourselves recognize that, like I said earlier, it is a maladaptive coping skill, although it is a coping skill. And so we want to validate the fact that they are attempting to try to solve whatever this problem is, but there are healthier ways that we can do that with them. So, we can ask, what is that purpose that is fulfilling? Are there other functions that could fulfill that need? Something else that we could do, and normalizing that purpose. Although we don't want to normalize the behavior, and we don't want to hyper focus on that. We want to direct attention to that trigger or the cause. I will tell you that if you have a child who is, cutting, or doing whatever that is, as scary as that is, if you react too strongly to it, and if you insist on like checking them or trying to take the items away or whatever that might be, that doesn't actually solve the problem. For example, I had a client at one point in time who was self-injuring, and the way I handle that is like, we talk about it, and they had given their parent different things, but basically ended up going in the bathroom and they took one of the little plastic soap containers and they broke it apart and it had like a shard of the plastic on it and they were using that. Like there's no way to eliminate that. Again, they can bite, they can scratch, they can do whatever. So the best thing you can do is keep an open line of communication, because it's better for them to come and talk to you about it, because otherwise they will just hide it. And, I think that that's a really scary thing for parents to hear. But when I have clients coming into my office and I talk to the parents, one of the things I say during our very first session is, if your child ever discloses to me that they are cutting, I want you to know that, first of all, as a clinician, I keep that in confidence with the kids, and don't necessarily disclose automatically to the parents, because I need them to trust me. I can't help them solve that problem if they don't tell me that there's a problem going on. And so, a lot of times I would also just say, I think there are a lot of kids who kind of experiment with this like once or twice, and then because they hear about it, it doesn't really help, it doesn't really do anything. And so then they kind of stop as well. So, I don't want to make it sound like I'm minimizing it, because I'm not. But sometimes actually what we end up doing as clinicians is, if we can't eliminate that behavior, sometimes we just focus on harm reduction. Meaning like, okay, well, if you're going to scratch or you're going to cut, how do you care for that? Like, where are the bandages? Do you have antibiotic ointment that you can put on it to make sure it doesn't get infected? Sometimes that's the way that we handle that a little bit differently. But again, realizing though that this is different than that suicidal ideation, where they're not actually, the goal is not to die. Now, of course, there could be self-injurious behavior that was so intense or so big that it could cause a major injury or even death, which of course we want to avoid. But it's a tricky subject to talk about, and we just have to kind of have those conversations and let kids be open about that. So what are some assessment and safety planning approaches that we can take just as parents? So first of all, we want to really work on just understanding their experiences. So lots of people have thoughts about death, and that does not always indicate that there's serious risk. As a matter of fact, going back to that normalization that we were just talking about, sometimes kids are so afraid or adults are so afraid to even verbalize the fact that they're thinking about death or dying. And so we want to make sure that they feel like it's okay, and recognize that most people at some point in their life experience some level of suicidal ideation. It might be very passive ideation. It might just be so, it's like, I wish I could go to sleep and I just never had to wake up. Like that's at the very low end of what we would consider as far as, concerning as far as suicidal ideation. But when the moment we make it okay to talk about that's the moment that we make it okay to ask for help. And so we really want kids to do that. And we also just want them to know that they're not alone, that there is a feeling of universality in this, and that it's okay to look at that and address it. We know that ADHD traits like impulsivity can increase the risk, but just because they have that trait, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like impulsiveness actually in a lot of ways can be a strength, especially like, I mean, if you are somebody who has a career where you have to make very quick decisions, if you have good instincts for that, then that impulsiveness where it's like you're just doing it, can be helpful. We also want to really focus on building resilience through and coping skills rather than eliminating all difficult thoughts. Like the goal is not to eliminate them. It's about like being able to withstand it, because who knows, you might have those thoughts come up again, or you might have another, I always feel like, especially for teenagers, there's that loss of whatever that first significant relationship is that they have. And, as adults, often we've experienced that loss, in different ways throughout our lives. But the first time, you don't have the opportunity to look back and go, well, you know what? I've been through this before. It sucks then. It sucks now. I've gotten through it though. I know I can get through this. Like that very first time can be, experiencing that loss is really overwhelming. And so we really want to help kids build that resilience. Like, how can you get through this? How can you know that you have the tools and the resources and the people around you who love you, that this is temporary and you can get through this. It's not going to last, forever. We want to normalize talking about emotions, including difficult ones. You will notice that as I've gone through this presentation, maybe you haven't noticed, but I actually rarely talk about negative emotions. I talk about comfortable and uncomfortable emotions because that really kind of helps to normalize that as far as the emotions that we're talking about. Like there's really no negative emotion. Like it might feel really uncomfortable, but emotions are there to serve a purpose. They give us information. They help us know how to react in certain situations. And so there should never be a situation where kids feel like they can't talk about uncomfortable emotions with us. But sometimes they feel like they shouldn't because it's like, oh, well, I felt jealous. Well, that's bad. I shouldn't admit that. Or, I felt embarrassed. I don't want to have to feel that again. So I don't want to talk about it. The more we talk about it, that actually is a really important piece of building up that resilience that we're talking about. And of course, seeking professional help. If you are concerned, and especially if those suicidal thoughts are persistent, you really want to make sure that you're getting some of that support from a clinician, from somebody who can help assess the risk. I'll be honest right now as we're going through this presentation. So I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning. I'm in a hotel room in Pennsylvania because I'm doing a training tomorrow for some educators. And so I don't have my presenter view. So I'm going to go through a little bit of something, but I don't know if it's on another slide, but I can't see all my slides. So if your child discloses to you that they're experiencing some suicidal ideation, here's the very, very basics of how to do a suicide assessment. Right? This is like just down and dirty, very quick. You ask 3 questions, are you thinking about death and dying? And if so, get them to elicit like specifically what it is that they're thinking about. Are you thinking, and along with that, are you thinking about harming yourself? So thoughts is the first piece. The second part of it is, okay, so you've been thinking about hurting yourself. Have you thought about what you would do? Have you thought about how you would do that? So that's the plan. That's part 2. And then the third piece is, do you think you're going to do that? Are you planning to take action on it? Intent. So thoughts, plan, and intent. And that can help you get a feel for where kids are, where anybody is of any age, where they are as far as that spectrum of suicidality. So at the very, very low end, you have just thoughts of death or dying. Up above that, you have kind of like the thoughts that kind of come and go, passive ideation, like I wish I was dead. Or I wish I was, didn't have to deal with any of this, and I could just, go away and not have to ever come back. And then you get into like the more like, okay, I'm thinking about a plan. How would I do this? What would I actually do? And then when you have that intent, that's the most concerning of those. But having that information and can help you then communicate that with the people who are part of your child's support team in order to get the help that they really need. So what are some treatment options? What do we want to consider here? So first of all, inpatient treatment is not always the best first step for kids with ADHD. Depending on who you talk to, often, especially if you talk to a school counselor first, many schools have protocols in place where if somebody discloses suicidal ideation, they require that child, whatever age, to go and have an assessment at some sort of a treatment, place at the hospital, and then get, some sort of paperwork that allows them to come back to school saying that they're not at risk. I'm often concerned sometimes. Here's the thing about inpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment is useful if you cannot keep somebody safe. It is a place where people can go where they're going to try to tweak your medications. They're going to, keep you safe. You're not going to, you won't be in danger there. But especially for kids, I just often feel like there are ways that we can support them without necessarily going through the trauma of being in an inpatient treatment program, even if it's just for a few days. So talking to the clinician who's working with your child to make sure that they are, on board and trying to figure that out. And if you're not sure that you can keep them safe, then that's, totally understandable. So, I had a client one time who is autistic and ADHD, And, one of those traits of autism is having those specific special interests. And her special interest specifically was related to suicidality and self-injury. And she was consistently like having suicidal ideation. She really felt like she was supposed to die, that she wanted to die, that felt things would be better if she did. And she was in and out of some inpatient treatment programs for quite a while. And she's probably the one client I ever had who I was the most concerned about her safety. Like I really was very worried that she was going to attempt and complete suicide. Ultimately, though, after she had been in and out of inpatient treatment, it really wasn't doing anything for her, wasn't really helping all that much. And for a couple of years, while she was like in middle school, she was a teenager, maybe even, I don't know if it was the first part of high school, but definitely in middle school, she slept in her parents' bedroom. And they actually got one of those mattress pads that they put on the floor that was, those ones that give a like buzz if somebody gets out of bed, they have those available. Because, well, you couldn't lock her away. How are they going to keep her safe? Now that's an extreme case, but there are ways that we can really work to keep our kids safe. And so having those conversations, I think, is important. But that's a hard decision, but just be aware that there are other options. There are intensive outpatient programs. There are ways that you can keep your child safe, and just, kind of taking that into context as you try to make that decision. So you want to discuss all those options with your mental health provider, and then just also considering, what is the severity of their symptoms? Are you able to keep them safe at home? Is there available outpatient support? And also, what's your child's comfort with different settings? How are they going to react? Sometimes, I mean, for teenagers specifically, it really depends on their age and their development, how they handle that. But, some kids, it actually is a really great opportunity, especially if they just really need some medication and trying to figure that out a little bit. That's the great thing about inpatients. They can do that pretty quickly, and get some support going along with some therapy. So, but your child best, so you can be an active part of those treatment decisions. Really kind of trying to think through that. Another thing that we can do is just really recognize what the strengths are for our kids and what supports. So as we talk to our kids, we want to really like trying to think through and talk to them about all of these things. This is a two-way conversation that we're having with our kids. So what are their goals? What are the things that future orientation is so important when we're talking about reducing suicidal risk? We want to see that future. We want to know what the plan is. Are you looking forward to something next month, next year? What make that really concrete so that they can tie that, to their current experience and realize that there are things beyond whatever they might be feeling. We want to look at, what are the strategies that they like? What are their passions and interests that they could use as a distraction? When are they able to self-advocate effectively? Are there strategies that have worked in the past? And sensory tools are a big one. Are there certain sensory things that help your child? Maybe they need to jump on a trampoline. Maybe they need to sit in a little swivel chair like I am and swivel back and forth. Who knows what that might be? But having the weighted blankets, all of those different things can be really helpful. So then we can create a family safety plan. So just so you can keep an eye on things and know, like what signs tell you that your child or teen needs extra support? How do you know that all of a sudden, like you're like, okay, I can tell that their mood is just declining, something's going on. So, what do you look for? What are your look fors for your child that you can keep an eye on? Knowing those coping strategies, and it's so tricky because so often kids really don't like to be told to try a coping strategy. So trying to figure out a way that you can communicate that with them, or just have things available to them so that they can access those when they're necessary. Knowing who those trusted people are that they can talk to, that distraction piece, making that home environment safe, and then the emergency context and resources. So just a few other neurodiversity affirming approaches that we can take at home. So we want to just create a home environment that really accepts and values differences. It's hard. It is hard living in a neurodivergent household. Everyone has different sensory needs. Everyone has different executive functioning strengths and struggles. But recognizing that and making sure that our kids aren't feeling ashamed of the fact that this is the way their brains work. They can develop coping skills, they can develop hacks, but that it's also, just part of who they are. We want to talk about the concept of masking and hiding ADHD traits. Where are the benefits versus the drawbacks there? I often talk about, if you're super involved in the neurodiversity community, you'll hear a lot of conversations about masking and authenticity. And my opinion about this is that we all mask. We all have different personas in different environments, and that's okay. But really what we want to do is we want to try to weigh out, like, what are the benefits versus the drawbacks of masking in certain environments. So for example, now, like I told you, I'm in a hotel room, but it's helpful that this has a swivel seat here, because when I am doing these virtual presentations, I'm sitting in my office usually, or in my office or in my home office. And if I'm sitting in this chair, I'm swinging back and forth always. I've got these little fidget rings. I already flung one across the room earlier. Didn't notice it, but this is something that really helps me as far as, being distracted. It kind of, if I don't have this in my hand, I would be looking for everything else around me on my desk for something to play with. So when I'm thinking about masking, could I be super professional and sit here and sit very still and not have this in my hand or whatever? I mean, I could, but the benefits and the drawbacks, like, that doesn't offer enough benefits, like, in the situation. And it causes actual significant drawbacks where it's harder for me to focus. It's harder for me to do what I'm trying to do. So that's a decision that I've made, that I'm not going to try to mask those things when I'm in this type of an environment. But there might be other environments where I would. And so helping our kids recognize, like, what are the payoffs versus the drawbacks. Like, when you're in class, for example, like, if you need to fidget, how can you do that in a way that doesn't cause a disruption, that helps, that you don't feel called out or feel different, so that you can have, but you can also have the benefits of whatever that need might be. We can encourage expression and self-acceptance, so that they can, and also model self-acceptance even when we mess stuff up, because we all do. And then we just want to help them identify those safe spaces where they really can be fully themselves. As far as managing some of that impulsivity, visual reminders and cues for stop and think are really helpful. We can really use that as a way to make sure that, they can hopefully build that pattern of just that quick pause. Mindfulness is a good way to, like, just have that check-in and get used to that check-in. Anytime I do mindfulness activities with the clients in my office, the thing I remind them of is, mindfulness activities don't only work when you're dysregulated. You have to practice them when you're calm. It's like building up any sort of muscle. You have to practice it in a not in a high stakes situation, so that when you are in that high stakes situation, you are able to implement them and it is effective. Just establishing those clear and consistent routines and expectations. Some immediate positive reinforcement when they do have that, control those impulses, and then really working on identifying those long-term goals to help them see through just that, what's right in front of them. We talked about the self-advocacy. So what does that look like? At the elementary, asking for help, expressing needs. Middle school, explaining ADHD to friends, disclosing that diagnosis, requesting accommodations. At the high school, it looks like participating in IEP meetings, researching support options. Could be 504 meetings if they don't have an IEP, or whatever it might be, but helping them build that independence as they go forward. The thing that I will tell you is that if your child has a 504 plan, it is very important that by the time they graduate high school, they know what their accommodations are and that they are able to implement them and access them independently. Because when they go to college, every college is different. There's no exact protocol for what colleges require, or what colleges are required to offer. But the thing that is consistent is that colleges and professors are not responsible for making sure that kids access their accommodations. If you have an accommodation for extended time, it is your job to go to the disability services office, make your appointment, and tell that professor that that's where you're taking that assessment, or whatever that might be. If you're supposed to get copies of the notes, it is your responsibility to email that professor or touch base with that professor. They are not going to follow you around and make sure that you're having that. Some universities do have specific, like, support teams or tools that can be accessed. But in general, we want kids to be really ready to self-advocate as they get ready to graduate from high school. Focusing on sensory needs is a big one. So again, we talk so much about sensory needs when we talk about autism specifically, but ADHD is another one that has just a lot of sensory needs. So what calms or overwhelms your child? What's a toolkit you could put together? Where's your calm down corner? Can the school offer some of those sensory breaks? Don't ever let them take recess away from your child. And consider occupational therapy for some more targeted support. As far as the interpersonal piece, we can facilitate some of those supervised play dates, social activities, modeling those social skills at home, having them practice. If there is a social skills group or a therapy that could be helpful, that's something that's an option. And we really want the teachers to be able to coach and provide some tools for kids to develop those positive peer interactions. And again, structured activities can often be really helpful for kids because it helps them know what to expect. As opposed to an unstructured activity where if you have a lot of that inattention or impulsiveness, that can really get away from you. It makes it a lot harder. So that's everything that I have for you. I saw a couple of questions come in, but it's a little bit hard for me to manage. So I'm going to stop my share and kind of glance here. So, okay. Oh, there were no actual questions. So any questions anyone has, feel free or hop in.
Surely.
What I was going to say, when we're in education, when we ask a class a question and we, are waiting for someone to raise their hand, we call it wait time. As a therapist, we call it therapeutic use of silence. I'm great. I can sit here forever. So no, I don't have to have any questions. Talk about that impulsiveness, that need to fill in the blanks. That's something I've had to work on. Okay. So is it normal for a 10-year-old with ADHD and autism to say things like they don't want to be here anymore? I don't know. I don't know if I would say normal, but not uncommon, perhaps. And I think that is yeah, it's a big I think a lot of kids, one of the biggest factors for all neurodivergent people is loneliness. And how seriously should a parent take that? Take it seriously, but not literally, if that makes sense. You want to take it seriously, you want to understand that. Here's the thing, especially with the autism piece, for what it's worth. We talk about echolalia sometimes. And echolalia specifically, if anyone's unfamiliar, is a term that refers to using scripted statements over and over again. It can be a lot of different things. So sometimes somebody might literally ask a question and then the other person might repeat that question back before answering it. That's a type of echolalia. I had a client one time who, when he would get really dysregulated and have these meltdowns, he would make statements like, "I wish I was dead," or somebody should just kill me. But it was actually a form of echolalia. He's autistic and ADHD. It was not actually that he wanted to die. It was just I'm having these big, huge feelings, and this is how I can communicate them. So, to answer your question there, Jeremy, I guess my question would be does it go beyond that? Does it go beyond that? Is there any sort of plan or intent? Is there something more? That's when I would start to be more concerned. At the time that they're just saying they don't want to be here anymore, again, I would focus on okay, so how can we make it better? How can we make it so you do want to be here so that you're not feeling so overwhelmed? So let me know if you have a follow-up there. Krista, I'm in St. Louis. I'm in O'Fallon, Missouri, actually.
So follow up to what you were just saying. You're talking to your child about all of these things that he or she has been saying. How do you keep them safe while you're at home?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? It kind of cut out there for a second on my end.
Yeah. How do you keep them safe? What can you do until you get to their doctor or their therapist?
Well, I would say work on, stay with them, stay in the same space as much as you can. Try to see, I will tell you that social media, especially for our teens and adolescents, is not often a safe space. So maybe keep them off of those types of electronics. I would focus on, again, like what are the distractions? What are the coping skills that we can do? And again, if, hopefully if they've trusted you enough to disclose that they're thinking about it, they also trust you enough to tell you if they've got a plan. And if they've got a plan, then take action. I mean, did they say, oh, I thought I would just take a bunch of pills? I thought I would, are they thinking about like trying to cut themselves with a kitchen knife, something like that? I mean, you can lock those things up, you can get rid of them. I mean, I think that those are not unreasonable measures to take if you have a concern. And something I didn't mention during the presentation, but especially with younger kids, but also sometimes teens, even if the method that they are considering for like with their suicidal ideation, even if it's not realistic, we want to take that really seriously. So for example, I had a client one time who's was experiencing suicidal ideation, and the idea that he had about how he was going to kill himself was he was going to hold his breath a really long time until he just, died. His second plan was that he was going to take a balloon and fill it up really, really big and then inhale all of that air so that it would explode his lungs. Like, so he didn't have he didn't understand what he could do, but obviously like that is a plan. And, that he really, like that's as we look at that spectrum of the suicidal ideation, is pretty seriously. So, just being aware of that, but really kind of, I will say that one of the things, just kind of preventing any of those really impulsive actions as much as you can as well, again, to keep them safe. And hopefully then, I find that a lot of times, that suicidal ideation often doesn't last as long as what they might feel like it will in the moment. And if you get them through that, in that amount of time, then keep monitoring it until you get to that doctor or that clinician. So I see another question here. About the kid with negative peer interactions and how it carried into adolescence, if they stayed in the same school, does it get better if they switch schools? So I will be honest, I don't remember exactly what that particular research said, but it makes sense to me that would be the case, because it's more about how the other kids see that child. And so if there's different kids and they don't have that history there, of course, that child still has those, those experiences that influence how they see themselves and then how they interact with others. But yes, I believe that is the point that research was really trying to make, is that if you have the same connections, the same people that you're around, they don't always just forget those things. It doesn't just go away.
Are there any other questions? Because we have run past the hour, so I don't want to keep everyone beyond the time. And Jeremy has been participating, obviously, but she texted me to let me know that she's dealing with a family emergency, so she's going to stay off camera now. So she's still attending and listening. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you very much. This was a fantastic talk, and it was recorded. I will wipe everybody's names off if it shows on the screen, just so that doesn't show. And then Emily, is it okay with you if I also share your slides, a PDF of those?
Yeah, I'll send them to you in a PDF. Is that okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad everyone was able to hear this talk. It's not a positive talk, but knowledge is power.
It's not super fun talk. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hopefully learn and use